My name is John Silvester. I'm a reporter with the Age newspaper. Some people call me Sly of the Underworld. There are 5 million crime stories in the naked city, and this is one of them. It's fair to say I've got a good head for radio, so it came as some surprise when I was asked to appear in the new Channel 9 3-part documentary, Naked City Hitmen. Truth is, I'm not particularly good talent on TV, but what I did bring was an old contact book. I contacted 15 people from the law, from police, prosecutors and elsewhere who had a real knowledge on the subject. Of the 15, 14 said yes. Their stories are truly remarkable. The 2 driving forces in this documentary are producers Michael Venables and Graham Watson. And because they have no experience in the true crime market, I don't think they've gone down the usual path. This documentary doesn't use the usual suspects. We talk to judges, we talk to police, we get the full inside story on Melbourne's underbelly war.
Get in, get down, stay down, you're right.
And a person who was right in the middle was Stuart Bateson, one of the members of the Purana taskforce. Today, Stuart tells his story. Stuart Bateson, key member of the Piranha task force. My goodness, it just seems like yesterday, but it's well over 20 years ago.
It is, yeah. I was just thinking then, my first involvement was back in 1999. And although it took up, a lot of my life between that time and probably 2007, 2008, somehow it has a habit of just keep coming back as I think they said in, I can't remember which movie it was, but you think you're out and they just drag you back in.
Because first one, Mad Richard Mladenovic down at the hotel in St Kilda.
It was in one of the worst hotels in St Kilda, where it was generally used for street prostitution for their clients to come back, and Richard Mladenovic was there one night, and ultimately one person stormed into his room and shot him in the head.
Richard Mladenovic, he was gunned down in a St Kilda hotel during Melbourne's gangland war. Police say the investigation is ongoing, and that $1 million reward for information, that is still on.
I remember the crime, and with his background it wasn't a surprise, but what we didn't know is that there was going to be this invisible thread that would go all the way through. It was almost certainly ordered by Carl Williams.
Undoubtedly. And in those first few hours of that investigation, we thought to ourselves, it could be anyone. Lots of people hated Richard Mladenovic. He had a fearsome reputation in jail. He made a lot of enemies. But it wasn't long before we started to figure out that Carl Williams and some of his cronies were looking to kill Richard Mladenovic. He had looked after Carl recently when he'd been in jail. I've said this before, Carl wasn't particularly brave and he needed protection in jail, and he found that with Richard Mladenovic. But when he got out and Richard got out, Richard wanted a bit of payback. He wanted a bit of money from Carl Williams and their crew, which were beginning to earn quite a deal of money from ecstasy trafficking. But Carl didn't want to give him that money. He didn't want to share it with Richard. And ultimately, that was the motive for Richard's death.
And 11 years later, in 2010, Carl Williams gets bashed to death in Barwon prison. He had become an informer, and I'm convinced that hit on Williams was organised by the person who had actually done the shooting of Mad Richard, because he couldn't allow Carl to become an informer in case he pointed the finger at him.
Exactly. And there was a few rumours going about why Carl was murdered, but undoubtedly, and I agree with you, the most likely scenario is that people who were involved in the murder of Richard Mladenovic did not want Carl Williams speaking to the police. Now, at that time, Carl wasn't speaking about that murder, but the fact that he was speaking to police concerned them greatly. And I've got no doubt that's one the most likely reasons that Carl Williams was murdered.
So when Carl comes, into your orbit, he's not I wouldn't have thought he was a significant crook.
He wasn't really. He was from Broadmeadows. When I first met him, he wasn't particularly impressive. He didn't seem particularly smart. He didn't seem particularly aggressive or well connected. But like many, I think I underestimated him because what I came to know, 10 years later when he finally was convicted of several murders, he was a lot smarter than he looked, and he was certainly a lot more violent than I thought he perhaps was when I first met him back in 1999.
Flash forward a couple of months after Mad Richard, and Carl himself gets shot in a park in Gladstone Park in October 1999 by Jason Moran with his half-brother Mark Moran.
You don't know who shot you?
No, I don't know who shot me.
Well, you have your eyes shut at the time, or?
Yeah, well, I've got no idea really who shot me. It's,
Carl goes to hospital, but he remembers what was said, which was Mark saying, shoot him in the head and finish the job, and Jason saying, well, how are we going to get our money back? So he then decides he's got to kill all the Morans. You are part of the crew that investigates the first of that, which is Mark Moran, killed outside his Aberfeldy home.
Yeah, and, Mark Moran was right. They should have shot him, and they should have killed him at that point in time because they didn't, and Carl Williams swore he'd get his revenge against all of the Moran family. And he started with Mark, but he didn't stop there.
And of course, you're doing that job, and I imagine it's the same with Mark Moran. He would have had enemies. And was Carl in the frame early doors?
He was to a certain extent because we had some information that indicated that he was. And in fact, the crew, I wasn't there that night, but the crew actually went around and executed a search warrant at his house. So they had some belief that he was involved. But I've got to say the Moran family didn't believe it was him. They didn't think he was capable. They believed it was Rodney Collins that had committed the murder, or Dino Dibra was the other theory that the Morans were following. They didn't think Carl was capable of it. But once again, they underestimated him. So
all these murders are being investigated by different parts of the homicide squad, and it was Senior Sergeant Phil Swindells who had a look at Gallipolides, Dibra, and one other.
Yeah, so there was a couple of murders that started to look very significantly that they were connected, and yeah, they were. We, as the homicide squad in those days, whoever was on call would go out to that particular murder, and we'd follow that case through to completion. And Phil Swindells was the first one. He was a senior sergeant there, a long-time member of the homicide squad. He started to look at these things and said, these are all connected.
He identified Andrew Veniamin,
Yes.
Veniamin, as the link between the three murders.
He did, and Andrew Veniamin was a significant link, but it was Phil Swindells who first put it together. He put up a report to the hierarchy of Victoria Police to form a task force. And that task force was formed and called Purana. But in those first days, there was only 7 people involved in that task force, Phil and his crew. So effectively, Phil managed to negotiate his crew being taken off call so they could concentrate on these murders. But it was to grow in years to come as the murders continued to occur.
Once Jason Moran and Pasquale Barbaro were killed in front of those kids, that was non-negotiable, and that's when finally the resources came.
That one was the one that changed everything.
Barbaro was murdered as he sat alongside notorious criminal Jason Moran in their car at Essendon last Saturday after an Auskick session. Both shot dead while 5 children sat in the back.
One mourner said the way Moran died was the ultimate insult. Today, for the second time in 3 years, Mother Judith followed a son's casket from the church.
Police can only hope these latest killings won't lead to more bloody reprisals.
There's always been in Melbourne underworld wars to say. We've had the Painters and Dockers War, the Market Garden War. It seems to be in Melbourne, these things happen from time to time. And although the police would never tolerate that and would always do our best to solve those murders, when that murder of Jason Moran, Pasquale Barbaro happened at an Auskick clinic, in front of all those kids who were, variously sprayed with blood and just such a shocking crime. I remember Christine Nixon, who was the Chief Commissioner at the time, going, "This is it. We've got to stop this." And it was at that point, there was a big recruitment into the task force.
While the homicide squad tries to narrow down a list of suspects, one group of detectives sure to take more than a passing interest in Moran's death will be Taskforce Purana, set up to investigate underworld killings. And that list is extensive.
I joined from another homicide crew and, we grew to a size of 55 detectives, analysts. But more importantly, we were supported by hundreds of police working in a covert capacity, helping us with our surveillance and other activities. So, the resources Victoria Police put in as a result of that murder was crucial to the outcomes we achieved in the end.
Yeah, it was fairly amazing because Phil rang me at one point because you were coming from ground zero. There was so little intelligence about that crew. He said, "What have you got the newspapers? What we now call open source.
Yes.
What have you got that we can use?"
Well, it's funny you should say that because when I first started to look into Jason Moran because of these murders, I asked for our most recent profile on him and they provided me with an address that I knew he hadn't lived at for at least 3 or 4 years. So we had a long way to go to bring ourselves up to speed, and that took time. But we did. And even these murders kept happening. And I think, from a public's point of view, at various times we looked powerless to stop it. Inside the task force, we knew we were getting somewhere. We knew that intelligence was building. We knew who was who and why some of these were occurring. We just needed a bit of time to get ahead of the game. And eventually, I guess we got our first breakthrough with the murder of Michael Marshall.
Yeah, well, that's an amazing story because it's at the height of idiocy because you had a bug in their clean car and they found it.
Yeah, so in the week leading up to that murder, through a web of electronic surveillance we got an indication that they were going to commit some sort of crime in and around Joy Street, South Yarra. And not far, probably 50 or 80 metres away from Joy Street was the Bush Inn Hotel. And we actually suspected that they were going to commit an armed robbery on Cox Plate Day. It was just prior to Cox Plate Day. And, the two people that we were most concerned about who were doing this surveillance were known armed robbers. So we thought that might be what's occurring. We didn't really know that Michael Marshall lived in that house in Joy Street. And in the week leading up, we got wind that they were sourcing a clean car, a car that couldn't be traced back to them. We managed to get a listening device into that car. And on the Thursday, and I think before the murder on the Saturday, they picked up the car. And as they were backing out, something didn't look right for them. And they stopped the car and they started going through the car. And lo and behold, they found our listening device. But on the Friday, our two suspects, our two hitmen, went round to see Carl Williams. And we thought our job was blown. There's no way they were going to commit whatever they were going to commit. And our crew decided we might take off to the Cox Plate Day and have a look at the races. That was a mistake because on Cox Plate Day, they used their own car. And all of a sudden we got a call from the people listening to the device in that car and they said, "Oh, we think they're going to do something." They could hear them playing with a gun. And lo and behold, that was the day they murdered Michael Marshall in front of his 5-year-old son.
And it was recorded and it's absolutely chilling.
Chilling. It is unbelievable to actually hear them identify him pull into the street. He'd been out collecting, ironically, hot dogs, rolls for his hot dog business he operated. When he pulled around into the street, you hear them on the listening device say, "That's him, go, go, go." They drive up the street. You hear that the gunman gets out of the car.
Faster. Yeah, go.
And the driver takes off to the right. He drives along to the next street over. You hear the shots. You hear the 5 shots that are fired into Michael Marshall's head. And then not long after, you hear the gunman get into the car and the driver says quite insistently, "Get down, down, down."
Get in, get down. Get down. Nice and down. Stay down. Stay down. You're right.
And we hear them discuss the murder and what happens on their way back to one of the Hitmen's houses, where we also hear on listening devices them disposing of evidence, getting rid of the gun, getting rid of their clothes. But most importantly, when they get back to the house, they make a call to Carl Williams. And what turned out to be a significant piece of evidence, they said to Carl, "You know that horse you tipped us? It's just been scratched."
Mick Marshall was felled by a volley of gunshots in front of his wife and 5-year-old son outside their South Yarra home.
The 5-year-old boy was there and witnessed it. I mean, he spoke to police about what happened.
Yeah, it was shocking, really. And I remember it had such a big impact on my partner at the time, Detective Michelle Curley, because she spoke to him and he said he watched his father get shot in the head 5 times from the side of the road, and he said, "I wanted to help Daddy, but I'm not allowed to cross the road without holding his hand." And sometimes I think we can concentrate on these guys and their criminal past, and perhaps some people might even say they deserve it. But when you see the human impact of their murders on their family and the innocent people that are around them, it's much more than that. And it certainly did motivate everyone in the task force.
Detectives had arrested 2 men they allege are responsible for Melbourne's 21st gangland murder in 5 years.
The arrests were made by investigators working as part of Operation Purana. We think this is a significant breakthrough for us.
I always thought that the hitman, the runner, was like the boss, because the driver sounds like a subordinate role. But when you hear that audio, it seems to me that the driver's running the show.
Yeah, there's no doubt in my mind that the driver had the smarts. He, in lots of ways, was a horrible person. Not only was he a murderer, which he illustrated on that particular day, but he was a known rapist. And we dealt with him over many years. He ended up, as you know, becoming a Crown witness for us. But he was the type of person where I walked away with, from every interaction, just feeling horrible that I had to deal with him. And when I talk about the runner and the driver, we have to use those names because ultimately they became Crown witnesses. And when you become a Crown witness, your identity is protected, not just for that court case, but forever.
Well, I've now seen, and this is going to be in the Channel 9 series, Naked City Hitmen, I've now seen the vision of you sort of duchessing or dealing with the runner, and where he's doing a bit of a dance, sort of indicating I might be able to help you, but he's not actually giving you anything. It was this elaborate sort of fan dance.
Yeah, that was actually the driver in the car park of the St Kilda Road Police Station. We got him out to talk to him and interview him. This was post his arrest for the Michael Marshall, and we got him out to interview him about Jason Moran's murder, and we covertly recorded him. Because there was one thing about the driver, he was always looking for a deal. I felt that he was always going to give evidence for us. We just had to get him into a position between a rock and a hard place where he knew that was his only way out. But you see in that video him being very cagey. And, in lots of ways, that was the dance that we had to play with these guys. Horrible people, murderers, in terms of our own values, completely opposite to what we believed in. But we had to deal with them and form some sort of rapport with them to make sure they stayed on board and gave evidence. Because, as I said in the documentary you mentioned, we knew that we needed someone in the witness box that either heard it or did it. those two people became such significant witnesses and ultimately responsible for Carl Williams being convicted of murder.
And a key member of this sort of attack was Supreme Court Justice Paul Coghlan, who was then Director of Public Prosecutions, because he was the one who drove through the deal of the century for the driver. That was a real sweet deal. And then once that deal was through, they all lined up to get similar deals.
Yeah. Incredible courage by Justice Coghlan. It's our job as the police to collect the information. It's our job to present what these witnesses could say, should they be given a deal. But it's ultimately the DPP, Paul Coghlan in these circumstances, and a Supreme Court Judge, Betty King, that makes these deals in the end. And, in my view, Justice Coghlan, he went on to become a Supreme Court Judge. He showed great courage in making those decisions.
As a matter of policy, you generally don't do deals with murderers, but one of the first ones who came forward were people acting on behalf of the driver. And I said, well, if we could have him as a witness, that would really help us a good deal about the whole ongoing investigation. And what I felt at that stage was we just needed a breakthrough.
And the judges involved also had to make calls on these things. They had to balance the need for having witnesses in the witness box for Carl Williams with the need to punish these people because they had committed such horrific crimes.
We'll be right back after the break. While you're here, why not subscribe to The Age or Sydney Morning Herald? Serious journalism costs, and we are serious journalists. Most of us anyway. Piranha's making progress, but the murders are still happening. And Carl Veniamin is becoming a serial killer because he's got the Morans, or most of them, but he's now broadening out. And a figure loosely associated with the Morans is Graham Kinniburgh. Graham Kinniburgh, undeniably Australia's best safe breaker, a key figure in the underworld, but really he's slowed down. He's in his early 60s. He's really retired. But he's smart enough to know that he could well be in Carl's radar, and you certainly knew that to be true. So you went to see Graham?
Yeah, we did. We went to see Graham at his house. Graham, as you're right, Graham was one of the most respected criminals in Melbourne. He was well known in nearly every criminal circle. And in lots of ways, he was the upper echelon, the establishment of Melbourne's underworld. But he was on Carl's radar because Carl had been getting the Morans, who were associated with Graham Kinniburgh and others in what was loosely called the Carlton crew. But we went and saw Graham Kinniburgh. I went out and spoke to him at his house in Kew, sat down and warned him and said, Graham, we think your life is in danger. And he turned to me without a word of a lie and said, well, something's going to get you. It's better than cancer.
So it was a fatalist, and of course, right outside where you had been speaking to him is where in December 2003
he was shot.
He was shot dead.
He was shot dead. He was carrying a gun himself. He managed to get a shot off from that gun, but ultimately he was murdered in cold blood.
Now, this made it personal for Mick Gatto. Mick had been watching all this and nothing to do with me. Carl got shot. He's trying to revenge it. Well, that's up to him. But he was really close to Graham, and so it became personal. So there's a meeting down at Crown Casino. I think Veniamin was there, Carl was there, Mick was there, Mario Condello.
Mario Condello was there as well.
What do you think happened at that meeting?
Well, we know, Mick Gatto's spoken about it publicly since that time, I think in a documentary with you, John, but, he said, I wanted to find out what occurred. He heard on the radar that Carl and Andrew Veniamin were responsible for Graham Kinniburgh's murder, and he put it to them. They both denied being involved, but as Mick has said publicly, I don't think I believed him. He didn't believe that they weren't involved. And, you know, from our point of view, from the task force, that belief was probably what brought on the shooting of Andrew Veniamin.
Well, it was an own goal by Veniamin, because one of the statements from one of Carl's right-hand men, he said after that meeting, Carl rang him and said, "What do you think about Mick? You know, should I go after him?" And he said, "Oh, I wouldn't have a clue. Talk to Benji, Andrew Veniamin." And it was Veniamin who said, "No, you've got to do him." And in the documentary, I was staggered, because there's recordings of conversations between Mick and Veniamin, and they're very chatty. And then ultimately, Mick makes a call to Veniamin and invites him to a restaurant in Carlton.
I've been meaning to drop in at that joint where you're there. Mate, I'm there every day, buddy. Every day we're there. I'll drop in there. You're welcome anytime, mate. Yeah, buddy. Bye, mate. Thanks.
What we do know is that Veniamin and Gatto went into a sort of dead-end corridor. There was a dispute, and a shot was fired which missed Mick, and then a shot was fired which killed Veniamin.
I suggested we go out the back and have a quiet chat, and that's when it all took place, you know. I was telling him that the rumours were still right, that he had something to do with Graham, and he said, "Mate, I wouldn't do that to you, you're a friend of mine." And I said, "Well, it's funny you say that, PK and Dibra were your friends too, and you killed them." And anyway, we got in a little bit of a heated argument. I just said, "No, look, you can't be trusted, and I don't want you in my company."
Mick was charged and beat the charges on the grounds of self-defence. But when he was actually brought in to be interviewed, which I assume was a no-comment interview, what was his demeanour?
Look, I think, you know, looking back at it now, he was pretty cool. No doubt knew what was occurring. He knew after the shooting that he'd be brought in and interviewed. He's experienced in that regard, and I got no doubt he knew he was going to be charged and remanded in custody. And throughout that period, although he dealt mostly with one of our great detectives, Boris Buick, he was cool, he was calm, he was collected. And on one occasion, when he was being taken down in the lift on his way to the custody centre, one of my colleagues said to him, "Listen, Mick, we've got to say that Andrew Veniamin was the one that worried us. You know, as his level of violence increased, he worried us. And you've probably done us a favour." And Mick simply said, "Boys, when it's time to dance, you got to get on the dance floor."
I was there when he was acquitted, and it wasn't a great case, but he was 49, would have got 16 on the bottom if he was found guilty. And he just talked to his family, and he said, "We're going to hear the most important words of our life. It'll either be one word or two."
Yeah. And looking back on that trial, you know, Andrew Veniamin's character was put very much squarely as a fact in issue. And there's no doubt Andrew Veniamin was responsible for many, many murders. And we, as task force detectives, there's a lot of people that were called up, and we testified to that. Was he likely to carry a gun? Yes, he was. Was he responsible for people's murders? Yes, he was. So when he argued self-defence, there's obviously the jury found that reasonable doubt, and he was acquitted.
Yeah, there's an old saying, the survivor owns the crime scene. So.
That's right, yeah.
The family's reunion was forged on the steps of the Supreme Court yesterday when the 49-year-old was acquitted of murdering Andrew Veniamin in a Carlton restaurant. Gatto maintained he'd shot the alleged hitman in self-defence.
Thank God for the jury system. That's all I can say.
We thought the underbelly war ended with the conviction of Carl Williams, where he was convicted of the Michael Marshall murder and then subsequently pleaded guilty because the evidence was overwhelming. And it was Justice Betty King who ran that trial. And in the documentary, Justice King talks about that moment when she was informed that Carl was prepared to plead guilty, and she ordered her associate to immediately get him in court so it could be done now.
About 10 minutes later, my associate comes in and says, they said they can't. He's on the freeway down to Barwon and they can't turn the van around. And I just said, tell them if they don't turn the van around, they can do his time instead because I'll deal with them for contempt. Just tell them to do a U-turn and bring him right back right now.
Funny enough, they were able to get the thing to do a U-turn.
Justice King is not someone to be messed with. If she tells you to do something, you do it. And thank God she did that, because I remember clearly there was, will he plead guilty, will he not? Yes, the evidence was overwhelming, but he had his mum in one ear saying, don't do it. I believe in you, son, you're innocent, which of course Carl knew he wasn't. And then he had his lawyers on the other side saying, this is your chance to get a minimum sentence. If he hadn't have pleaded guilty and had have gone to trial, I think he would have got life with no chance of parole. So the tension over those couple of days, even a week or so leading up to that, was huge. And when he said those words, guilty, it was a relief for all of us. You know, all of us within the task force, all of us that had worked so hard on it for so many years. But I also suspect, you know, for Justice King, it was a relief because justice was done, but there was also no need to run trials that perhaps would have gone on for years.
Would have seen out her career. She would have purely been doing the underworld murders.
Carl Williams left court in a prison van, his smiley demeanour in the dock wiped from his face, his reign as Melbourne's most notorious mobster over. Convicted of 4 underworld slayings, Carl Williams could have committed up to 10 in a gangland war which started...
We all stopped treating him as some sort of B-grade movie star. The fact is that he's a criminal. He is one of the worst serial killers in the history of this state.
Now, your father turned up at court to see what his son did for a living. So how did that go?
Well, Dad was, retired gen and, very proud of me. And he said, oh, look, can I come in and watch the trial? And I said, geez, Dad, I don't think we generally get any supporters in court. But, yeah, all right, come in, but keep a low profile. And I rolled into court that particular day, and as soon as I got in there, the security guard said to me, your dad's looking for you. But sure enough, Dad came in and, witnessed it. I ended up getting to sit up in the gallery, and lo and behold, he ends up sitting very close to Roberta Williams. And Roberta Williams was using one of her fake long nails to sniff what looked like to my dad some white powder out of a small plastic bag. And he looked across at her, and Roberta offered him one. Which thankfully Dad refused. But he loved it, Dad. He's a very, very good man, my old man.
Must have been an amazing feeling when Carl finally pleaded guilty.
Yeah, it was great. I think in some ways, the murder of Michael Marshall, when we went through such a hard-fought trial, it was really hard-fought. I spent a significant amount of time in the witness box, as did other detectives, as did our star witness. And, we weren't completely confident that we were going to get over the line. But when that jury foreman said the words guilty, perhaps was one of the best moments of our career.
Because you were with Michelle Curley?
I was sitting with Michelle Curley, and she grabbed my hand and gave it a little squeeze.
Well, Michelle was an absolute jet and responsible, I believe, in turning some of these crooks into witnesses.
Michelle was terrific. We spent a lot of time with both the driver and the runner. And, I think we had them out of jail for 28 days, in secret locations, making statements, detailing a lot of their criminal past. And Michelle was the person that held that glue together. Even though she was disgusted by these individuals, she kept that rapport going with them. That ultimately really got them on our side and got them cooperating to the level that they did. I feel lucky to be sitting here talking to you, but there was 55 detectives involved in that task force, and all of them played crucial roles. There was a lot of work that got put in, and there was no doubt we knew what we were dealing with. We knew we were involved in something serious that was part and would be part of Melbourne's history. And the impact of that on all of us was significant.
Yes, and of course, Carl was full of bravado in the beginning, but ultimately he tried to do a deal over the murder of Christine and Terence Hodson. He'd made some statements and ultimately he was bashed to death in Barwon prison by the massive and very scary Johnson.
Yeah, so Carl perhaps made the mistake. He thought the criminal underworld would be okay with him providing evidence on what loosely involved corrupt police, and he thought he'd be safe. But when someone starts to give Crown evidence, they are very much labelled a dog in the prison system, and he was in a small cell with the worst person, Johnson, one of the meanest, most violent criminals in the state's history. But also the word got out. He was talking to the police. What was he saying? If he's talking about that issue, the Hodsons, maybe he'll start talking about the things that we did together.
Figure of Melbourne's underworld wars was reading a newspaper in the high-security Acacia unit of Melbourne's Barwon prison when Matthew Charles Johnson attacked, hitting him 8 times with the seat stem of an exercise bike.
It took 3 days to reject Matthew Johnson's claim that he'd killed cellmate Carl Williams because he feared for his own life. So it was widely known that Carl Williams was helping police.
I reckon he had Matthew Johnson in his little group because he was replicating what he did with Mad Richard years earlier. Really big man. He thought, if I keep him on side, he'll be my bodyguard. But ironically, he then gets killed because of what he did to Mad Richard all those years before.
Exactly. Made some bad choices, Carl, in the end.
That's for sure. Stuart, it's been a pleasure. We'll be watching you on the big screen. Naked City, The Hitmen.
Thank you, John. Thanks for getting me involved. Loved it.
This episode is reported by me and produced by a jet, Julia Carr-Katzel. Mixing by the ever-reliable Cormac Lally. And our chief button pusher, of course, is Tammy Mills. Thanks to Tom McKendrick and Lisa Muxworthy. We should always remember that Winston Churchill drank a pint of champagne at lunch, another pint at dinner. Then he would drink red wine. Adolf Hitler was a teetotaler. How did that work out?